Welcome to our last panel discussion for the conference, and this one is on the subject of justice reinvestment, and it's an all New Zealand panel this time around. As for those of us on this side of the Tasman, we'll hear some learnings from the New Zealand experience of introducing an Indigenous approach and a restorative justice approach as well, and also looking at a vision for the future of policing in New Zealand. And to take us to those subjects and more, our first panellist, who I caught up with yesterday, because unfortunately he's doing some of that partnership work today, is Wally Haumaha. He's the Deputy Commissioner of the New Zealand Police Service, and he has been working with the police service for coming up to 40 years now. Was acknowledged with the Queen's Service Medal in 1998 for his services to the community. He's been awarded the Police Commissioner's Commendation for establishing the first Memorandum of Understanding between police and 14 major iwi groups in the Bay of Plenty district around the turn of the century, and he's worked his way up through the ranks, no longer on the front line, but in Wellington at the highest levels of the police force, working with Maori groups, but also with Pacifica groups and other culturally and linguistically diverse groups, with responsibility for community policing and work that's associated with that. Now, sadly, as in the Australian context, the First People of New Zealand account for a large amount of the policing work in the New Zealand context, and evidence, stats showing that Maori are more likely to be victimised, reconvicted, re-imprisoned. So you can see why the Deputy Commissioner's work, Wally's work, is so important in creating partnerships so that Maori can live full lives, free from crime, free from road trauma, and also free from discrimination in the criminal justice system. It was an extensive chat with the Deputy Commissioner, but I asked him started by asking him how he came to be the partnerships guy in the New Zealand Police Service. Okay, we'll try and bring you that video of the Deputy Commissioner shortly. Apologies for the audio issues there if you saw that one but didn't hear Wally. We'll try and sort that out. Let's, in the meantime, though, go to who was going to be our second panelist, but is now our first panelist for this session. We'll try and come back to the Deputy Commissioner as soon as we can. Apologies again on that front as we talk about justice reinvestment in this discussion. Now, unfortunately, sorry, just give me 2 seconds. Just a reminder, while I'm just beavering away at this end to try and sort things out, that you will be able to watch the videos from today's sessions, as well as the yarning circles coming up, along with all the yarning circles, as well as the other sessions from the past 3 weeks on the on-air platform for 2 months after we wrap up this afternoon. And also a reminder to use the First Peoples 21 hashtag for today's discussion. Now, to talk about Maori approaches to justice, I want to bring in Hata Wilson. He's from the Northland area of New Zealand. Thank you for joining us, and I'm assuming that you can hear me and see me, and we can hear you and see you as well.
Yeah, tēnā koe, Dan. Can you hear me, Dan? Yeah.
I can. Tell us about some of the work that you have been focused on in the restorative justice space.
Well, I guess to kind of start with, can I just kind of mihi to our mana whenua in Australia, our Aboriginal First Nations people, and acknowledge their presence and past, and mihi to them and greet them in that way. So kia ora no tātou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Te mana whenua o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Me mihi hoki ki ngā mātou waka ki ngā iwi o ngā hau e whā. Ana reira, tēnā koutou. Yeah, greetings everyone. I'm actually based in Wellington, New Zealand, and I work for Te Rūnanganui or Aotearoa, an iwi-based organisation. And we've had quite a long relationship with New Zealand Police, and I guess in the development of the panel has been an opportunity to strengthen that relationship a lot stronger. And I'm sure when we get to see Wally's video, Wally will kind of give you the very kind of discreet and neat view around what occurred in that space between New Zealand and police and ourselves. We operate a panel here with New Zealand Police as a response to addressing offending and reoffending by Maori. We've tested this process probably since 2010, so it hasn't been a short journey, it's been a long journey. We've been able to grow it to a point where we're currently working with police referrals of something like 400 referrals a year through the panel. And on the panel, we have a very strong cultural focus to our work, balanced with an opportunity to think about what the justice piece of all of that means for people who are referred for offending. We operate together on the basis of utilising some of the early prevention programs that we can offer, and also on the utilising the pre-charge warning platform that police have a responsibility and obligation in their space. So we've been able to kind of blend our cultural stuff, if you like, with New Zealand Police. So we operate our panel 2 days a week. We would probably receive something like 10 to 12 referrals a week here at Waiwhitu, Lower Hut, and in Porirua. We operate from 9 o'clock in the morning till roughly about 3, 4 o'clock in the evening. And in the mix of that conversation or a panel, we like to think that we are having a very value-based conversation around how we might, in our cultural way, think about the notion of the cultural framework, which in a simple way is tika, being tika, and that's about doing the right thing as a translation. Being pono, which is believing in what we're doing is right, and aroha, and that is about being respectful in all of our engagements between police, ourselves, and those who come and join us in a panel process as participants and not offenders.
For that, sounds like some great work that you're doing there. Now, I'm going to try and bring in the Deputy Commissioner and the chat that I had with him yesterday, but stand by, Hata, if the gremlins persist and keep our Deputy Commissioner on mute, we'll just pick up our chat. But let's try and now listen hear from the Commissioner of the New Zealand Police Force.
Well, I joined the police 37 years ago, 1984. And of course, I come from a community where that Maori community has always looked at the service that that Maori, as well as other New Zealanders, expect and deserve. And of course, over the years, many reports were written about the issues around discrimination, around bias, against inequality, an unfair criminal justice system. And of course, when I look back at these issues over many years, of course, I suppose the fact that being Maori was a responsibility that went with being Maori as well as being a police officer, to try and look at shifting the culture of an organisation that didn't attract the criticisms of Maori people. And so what we were looking for was, how do we build the culture of an organisation that is fair, is equal, and that people have the trust and confidence. And to build that trust and confidence is, how do we engage and how do we bring them into the organisation? So in New Zealand, we operate under a Crown Māori relationship, which is Māori are a treaty partner inside of that relationship. Now, the obligations inside of that for Crown agencies is, how do they then, again, as I mentioned earlier, deliver a service that is fair and equal to Māori participants? So way back in 1996, several of our Māori leaders came together to address these issues of inequality. And what they said was the high rate of Māori offending and victimisation in the criminal justice system needed to be addressed. At that time, I think Māori were, in terms of Indigenous populations, were the second highest group that was second highest Indigenous group that was incarcerated in the Western world. So it made quite horrific reading at that time. So our leaders came together and said, how do we build a police service that our people can have the confidence and trust that they are going to do the right thing? So one of the key things we had to recognize was recognizing what are our obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi. So how do we become good partners with Māori? How do we provide protection to that community? And how do we engage Māori people as participants to help us look at what those criminal justice issues look like to them, and what did fairness look like to them? So one of the first things we looked at was building structure across the organisation and bringing Māori leaders into the organisation as key participants to advise the organisation, in particular the Commissioner of Police, on the right approaches in dealing with Māori communities. What could Māori communities expect from their New Zealand police? I mean, those were long conversations back in 1996, and trying to turn the culture of an organisation around was quite a significant task, and it certainly wasn't going to be a journey for the faint-hearted. We were supported, well and truly supported, by a commissioner of the day back in 1996, who was quite visionary at the time. And also working alongside of many of our Māori leaders, they came up with this proverb. And the proverb was something that went something like this: E tū ki te kai o te waka, kia pākea koe e ngā ngaru o te wā. Stand at the stern of the canoe and feel the bite of the future spraying at your face. In other words, they said the challenges that we were going to face at that time in getting a fair and just criminal justice system, as well as a fair and just New Zealand police, was to challenge the organisation across a range of areas around charging decisions, around looking at prosecutions, at looking at alternative pathways, looking at diversions, and examining a whole lot of areas where we were making decisions that were likely to lead Māori into the criminal justice system. I became the first person to be appointed as a senior sergeant in the district back in the late 1990s, to be the voice of the people back at that time in a district in Bay of Plenty. From there, my task was to look at how we could turn a district around and sign up key tribal leaders alongside of police, to partner with police and to challenge and look at some of the key issues, of course, at that time, looking at why the youth population was so high in the youth courts, looking at some of the adult apprehensions, looking at family harm, and addressing those issues together. We managed to sign a historical moment at that time by signing 4 major iwi in the Bay of Plenty district to partner with police. And of course, that set the template and the model that we used to follow right around the country. Following on from that, 2004, I moved from Rotorua to Wellington and took up a role in Wellington as focusing purely on Maori issues at that time and looking at strengthening the state of relationships with Maori organisations, Maori communities. And of course, that then, my brief then extended into looking at Pacific communities, ethnic communities, looking at the whole range of demographics across the country. And I guess that's where I picked up the role in terms of community partnerships.
Some of those early partnerships, what do you think the key lessons now, looking back 2 decades, 15 years on, some of the key lessons from those first partnerships were?
Well, I think the key lessons was, to recognise the strengths of what community brings to the table and the strengths of what police also have to carry out their functions and their obligations to keep communities safe in the best possible way. I think at that time we didn't probably realise that those community partnerships were going to be the key to long-term sustainable solutions, and building that trust and confidence with those community partners was paramount. I think now, picking up on that and fast forward to 2020, where we are now, building the structure across the organisation is really significant and important. Having those partnerships in 12 policing districts is important. To have the consent of policing with your community, but more importantly, the consent of Maori leaders sitting at your side and advising, commanders in the best possible way is significant. Of course, what we also learned from that was that we had to have a plan, we had to have a strategy in place, and the early days of building strategy was based on just looking at those particular drivers of crime. So what does burglary look like? What does theft look like? What does violence look like? And rather than getting into the actual addressing the crime types, the issue was more around how do we build a structure that's going to stand the test of time, and how do we build a structure that's going to be embedded in the fabric of policing? And of course, coupled with that is, once you build the structure, what is your plan going forward? What is the strategy that you're going to use to achieve, all of those areas that we are important to address, those drivers of demand and those crime types. So I think those are the key points for me. Plus also the leadership issues were really important. Getting the leadership across the organization to understand the significance of why community partnerships are so relevant and why it's important to think back as to why those principles of policing with consent were so important. If we lose the trust and confidence of our community partners, which we lost the trust of Maori in the early days of policing, right up until I would say the mid 1990s, till we started our journey and really got to understand what our obligations and commitments were to Crown Maori relationships. I think that set us on a new course and a new journey to, as I say, build structure, build strategy, look at the systems, whether we had the right systems in place to address those key issues. And of course, the impact of that was if police made better decisions at the front end, then those people, the only solutions wouldn't be just prosecution. So we could have divert people into community organizations, look at better options in dealing with their behavior, looking at our prevention techniques so that, if we came across a person, we could get better options to prevent that person from going into the system and being a long-time player in the system. I mean, that's our prevention first operating model. again, for us, it's about looking at, how do we create the best training packages and the best training consistency of practice to take our frontline staff, because ultimately it comes down to them as decision makers. And quite often some people would say, well, my job is to lock a person up, regardless of the offence. If they've committed an offence, say such as shoplifting, they deserve to go to court and they deserve to be prosecuted and punished. Whereas the thinking shifted and shifted to say, if I'm dealing with a person who has been shoplifting for 5 times, 6 times, and keeps coming to our attention, then what is the context? How do we get to understand the context of that? So is that person shopping because of greed, that they just want to do that? Or are there other things going on in their life? So how do we bring that sort of touch of humanity into that, to build that picture? And of course, now we ask our staff to think about those issues, ask the right questions. And of course, quite often you'll find that many of those people who are shoplifting to that degree often don't have money at home. Some of them are living in poor conditions. Some of them are shoplifting to feed their kids, for a whole range of issues that sit in that whole social area where people are living in poverty. So that was, those were key issues to understand around the context of policing and the context of coming into contact with some of those people who commit those offences. And so we wanted to look at, as I mentioned earlier, a better decision-making model and giving our frontline staff better alternatives. So we created a model which, for people who commit low-level offences, where it's not in the public interest to prosecute, was to look at alternative pathways. And so using the police common law of discretion, we decided to work with our community partners and set up what we call iwi panels. And the name of those iwi panels in Maori terms is a name called Te Pai Oranga, looking after the well-being of a person when they come in front of a panel, and a panel made up of community leaders, community providers, key people with the skills, knowledge and experience who understand behavioural change, who understand familial ties and how to work with families, not just working with the individual, but addressing the behaviour, addressing the issues of family. So those panels that we set up in the early days, we kicked off in 2014 with these iwi panels, and asked our people in terms of the partnership, you are now going to sit as a panel, and rather than taking an offender through the formal criminal justice system, we will use our common law right of discretion, and we will refer that person through to a panel to address those issues. And look, I have to say, there was a lot of skepticism around looking at alternative models of dealing with these issues. Some people thought that it was usurping the position of the judiciary. But again, we have as police officers that common law right of discretion. And if a person who was eligible to be referred to a person based on the offence type, then again we would take that option. So in order to be eligible for a referral to a panel and work with community providers, a person had to commit an offence of 6 months imprisonment or less, had to be 17 years of age, and 17 ages from 17 years upwards, sorry. And of course, that then some of the offence types were limited. We were operating in that space for some time, and of course the success of some of those persons going through those panels, the good news stories inside of there are significant. And of course, it reduced reoffending rates by 22.5% when they did a comparative sort of analysis of those who went through the formal system as opposed to those who went through the panels. And so the community providers provided better wraparound services. We're now at a stage where we have established 16 of those panels, and 15 panels, and one to be launched this week in one of our districts. And our intention is to go to 40 panels across the country. working with key organisations that have strong infrastructure, that have good community services, and are able to provide the support mechanisms to those people to prevent reoffending. And the system is really robust and strong. So I have a full team working on the setting up the policies, the systems, monitoring the program, doing contractual services with those organisations, and also then feeding back into the organisation in terms on a monthly basis what's coming through that pipeline. We're still fairly young in the process, but the results so far have been quite significant. And it's important because we have 58 courts operating around New Zealand, and of course giving options to the judges. So if the offender has to go through the formal process of having to go into court, then let's give our judges some options around alternative pathways as well. So if the offence is, say, shoplifting over $500, it has to, that person could end up in court, say for an offence of theft, up to $1,000. So rather than put a punitive sort of sentence in place, send that person to address their behavioural problems and ask questions why. It's often, Dan, digging into the why people are committing these offences that are really important. If I could give you an example of, a woman who committed an offence and was diverted to the panel, an offence of theft, and who didn't turn up. So our team, our police officers who thought she hadn't turned up for the hearing of the panel and wanted to go and understand why she hadn't turned up. So they went around to the house, around to her, visit her home. And inside that house she was sitting on the floor with her children, and they were sitting on a mattress, a bare mattress, in front of a fire, burning clothes in the middle of winter to keep warm. And nobody would have known the hardships that person was going through. And also to get, financial support, get other support, just to keep her family, in a position of safety. So the police officers went out, they ordered a truckload of firewood, they filled her cupboards up, they referred her to agencies, they got the support services in place. And that turned out to be a really awesome story. But there are numerous stories like that where people are living in abstract poverty, people are doing it hard, and are being referred, and some committing offences out of stupidity. A young person who's got a good career goes off and damages a building and then gets referred to the panel. That person is not a Maori person. So what's important to understand inside of the panel is that it's not exclusive to Maori people only. It's open to every member who is eligible to be diverted into that base. But the principles that surround that whole model is based on a cultural framework, and that cultural framework is one of understanding, not reading out the summary of facts straight away and saying you're here because you committed an offence at such and such a time, and these are the facts of the matter. The whole introduction is more or less about the panel saying, so where do you come from? Where did you grow up? Where is your family based? Are you employed? What are the issues that are happening with you at the moment? And really trying to get a feel for the person and their background and the circumstances that they're in. So, long story short, we are now waiting on government to look at how we can expand the programs and also not only deal with panels in the adult jurisdiction, but look at establishing panels in the youth area as well. So we're quite fortunate that we've got that strong infrastructure in place that we've modelled already. And now we can continue to build to address youth issues in that area. My intention is to move into the family harm space, where far better options are within that organisation to provide services to address, the issues around male offenders, and also dealing with women and children as victims of violent behaviour. So I think, again, by actually carrying out the practice, putting in proper practices and policy and consistency of standards is part of the trigger then that will influence our frontline staff to make better informed decisions and bring that touch of humanity, get to understand context a little bit better, and look at the impact that we have of people entering into the criminal justice system.
And that was my chat with Wally Haumaha from yesterday, the Deputy Commissioner of the New Zealand Police and the most senior Maori officer in the force as well. Of course, the Tamaiti Whangai services and agency responsible integrated the Hutt Valley region around Wellington, and prior to this he served as Regional Director of Maori development and has 40 years of public sector experience with a focus on crime prevention strategies and education, employment training and justice policy. Of course, all of those areas coming together when we're talking about justice reinvestment and crime prevention. Thanks for staying on and listening to the Deputy Commissioner there. What particularly resonated with you from what we heard there from New Zealand's top Maori cop when it comes to justice reinvestment partnerships?
Kia ora, Dan. Yeah, look, I just kind of support Wally in this way. I think he's set the scene very well for what the opportunities kind of can present if we think how we might begin to do things differently. But look at what is it that we're trying to address and be pretty clear about that. So if we kind of think about the Māori issues and the Māori problems that we've kind of been presented with, then I think the whole notion around trying to give more autonomy back to Māori communities to actually do their magic that could be helpful in treating the issues for their own whānau and families. I tend to think about things in this way in some respects. We live in our kind of world today, and shit happens. Yeah, excuse the language. And you got to kind of say is, well, how do we deal with this? What do we need to do? So when I kind of think about that, and it's back to Wally's kind of focus around, so what value does punishment have for our society? Yeah. And, for centuries, we've been kind of running a justice system that's pretty much been about punishment and pretty much about negative things, and particularly about being counterproductive. So why do we start to kind of think about potential then? And what can, in my words, how can we realise Maori potential then if Māori are being seen as the problem? And then what would that look like in a process that Wally's just described as, strong infrastructure, strong leadership at the centre of government, an organisation that has internal infrastructure that supports communities to do their business, on the ground. Why? Because they have relationships across all families in our communities. They know who they are. Some of them actually work in the homes, and we kind of keep thinking about building those relationships with our families. Then we've got to shift the thinking away from punishment and less emphasis on punishment, more emphasis on healing, I think, and what that could look like if we thought culturally strong in our Maori space. That's what I mentioned earlier was a kind of simple framework that we've looked at around tika, pono and aroha. Those three dimensions around do the right thing by the people that are being referred. Yeah. If we think about pono, believe what we're doing is doing the right thing. And how do we then kind of think about how we do that? Well, be respectful. Yeah, and everybody, if we thought about that for a second, Wally mentioned the all of citizenship piece. We all live in Aotearoa, yeah, and we are all exposed to government systems at play, and how those government systems are built to support the citizenship. Then Māori people, Pacific people are equally eligible for that citizenship support. And so there's opportunities here for the iwi Justice Panel or Te Pai Oranga to provide an avenue, to provide a vehicle for addressing some harm, but in a culturally appropriate way. And now if we kind of think about this notion, that what's good for Māori and Pacific people is actually good for all people. And if we keep thinking like that, I think we're on a road, you know, to a very neat pathway going forward. Our panel actually, we work on something like a ratio of 50% Māori and 50% others. So when we talk about, I think Wally mentioned a little bit about getting infrastructure right. So evidence-led policing has been part of their modus operandi for a while. We've been able to provide evidence around what supports Māori potential development can support all people development. And that's through, like I said earlier, we deal with something like 10 cases a week here in Lower Hutt, probably another 5 in Puridia, so 15 cases a week. So when you kind of build that up, the potential, and you can, I think one survey that police have done 12 months ago registered something like, in their measurements, something like 92% of completion rates for those coming into our panel or being referred for support. When I kind of think about that process, then it is about a plan, having a conversation, having a look at what's happened in committing the offence, what's the underlying things behind that offence, and then what is a plan that they might think of might be helpful to actually address those offending patterns, but also about what other troubles kind of ailing them. The other added value is they actually come with a family member, yeah, or a support person. So that gives us another opportunity to talk about their families and their whānau and what support they have in their whānau. And that's kind of at the heart for a lot of our mahi, our work, all right, in this area. And it is about being whānau-centric. It is about strengthening our families to support each other. And then how do we as providers in our whānau order collective, so we are a part of the National Whānau Order Collective program across the country. So we've got a standard systemised approach to whānau order, whānau wellbeing. And as Wally said, there's an opportunity to connect our people to more holistic services that are available in our communities. And it's that other piece, I think, that's a real opportunity, is that we have our workers that can kind of walk in homes, and can kind of help within a home. And that's, I think, our point of difference.
I'm going to have to, you might have to answer this question more fully in the yarning circle, because I'm conscious that we need to give our attendees a break before they jump into the yarning circles, because we need everybody to be at peak performance for what are set to be 4 great yarning circles. But in just 30 seconds or so, just why do you think that a program, the panels designed with Maori, why do you say that then becomes better for non-Maori New Zealanders? Why is that then a successful program for New Zealanders of an Anglo background, let's say?
Look, I've got a simple answer for that. I think Wally said a really key word for me, and that was about bringing humanity back into our systems. You know, we're kind of thinking of punishment. But if we think about, we've come to a panel process for healing, not to be punished. So we actually start our panel off like that. You know, we're not a court, and we're not going to sit in judgment of what you did. but we do want to have a conversation about the rights and wrongs about that. But what more importantly, what can you do about that for yourself? And if you have a family member with you, or a friend, a support person, then what can they contribute to help their kin or the people that they're coming with? Now that's across cultures. That's not just about Maori. Lost you there, Dan. So if I could round it off in this comment and go and wait for the green room, I guess, to have a wider conversation, is that, we were part of the restorative justice movement in the past. So that practice was pretty much kind of driven off a post-court process. And in that process, it was about someone who had already been sentenced. I think the difference in this is we've got a restorative justice practice that's happening in a prevention space. And how do we then complement opportunities to utilise what we've learned in that restorative justice modelling and the principles in that, and how do we blend that then with our cultural principles for Māori and for Pacific and others as a multicultural country.